this episode of Newt's World, the USS Cowpens and her crew weren't your typical heroes. She was a flat top that the U.S. Navy initially didn't want, with a captain nearly scapegoated for the loss of his last command, pilots who self-trained on the planes they would fly into combat, and sailors that had been in uniform barely longer than the ship had been afloat. Despite their humble origins, Cowpens and her band of second-string reservists and citizen sailors served with distinction, fighting in nearly every major carrier operation from 1943 to 1945. Together, they faced a deadly typhoon that brought the ship to the verge of capsizing, and at war's end, there was only one U.S. aircraft carrier in Tokyo Bay to witness the Japanese surrender, the Mighty Moo. In the years to follow, Cowpen's service has become the wellspring for a remarkable modern tradition, both within the U.S. Navy and the small southern town that still celebrates her legacy with a festival every year. The Mighty Moo is a biography of a World War II aircraft carrier as told through the voices of its heroic crew, a band of brothers at sea. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Nathan Canestaro. He is a professional intelligence officer whose research on his grandfather's service in World War II led to a decade-long effort to uncover the story of Cowpens and her crew. He is currently on assignment to the National Intelligence Council. Nathan, welcome, and thank you for joining me at Newt's World.
Well, thank you, sir. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
I have to confess, I found the topic absolutely fascinating and from angles I would never have dreamed of. And as I understand it, it began with research into your grandfather's service in World War II, and that led you to a decade-long research project of the story of the USS Cowpens. What did you know about your grandfather's service before you started researching? What was it about chatting with your grandfather and his service in World War II that led you to a decade-long research project?
The simplest answer to that question is he wouldn't tell me anything. Like many men of his generation, he was traumatized by his experience in the war. When he came home, he wanted to put it behind him, and he would just sort of hint at things that had happened to him without really getting into the details. So for a guy like me who's interested in World War II history and grew up with Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, the fact that there was a story here that he was uncomfortable sharing was kind of catnip. And after he passed in 2010, I resolved to go looking for this story to try and find out what Grandpa wouldn't tell me. And in so doing, found this amazing story about his ship and his crew, which no one had really ever heard of. It's kind of a forgotten aspect of the Second World War.
Talk briefly about your grandfather's own experience in the war.
Sure. So he was a tail gunner on a torpedo bomber in the Pacific, an Avenger torpedo bomber, the same sort of plane that George H.W. Bush flew in the Second World War. And he flew from this light aircraft carrier called the USS Cowpens. And he was part of Torpedo Squadron 22. And he arrived in the war mid-44 and stayed until 45 or so, February, March 45. Spent a lot of time in the battle for the liberation of the Philippines.
Given that background, how did you then make the leap to deciding you really wanted to know about the aircraft carrier Cowpens?
Partly because I'd never heard of it. When you think about World War II aircraft carriers like the Intrepid in New York City or Yorktown in South Carolina, the little light aircraft carriers never come to mind. I'd never heard of it, and the Navy is very good at keeping records, and I started digging through all the official documents and sort of learning the story of what it went through and kind of some of the characters aboard. I consider myself fairly well informed on the war, but I'm like, why have I never heard of any of this? It's kind of this story that just hasn't been told, and those are pretty rare these days with World War II history. I said to my then girlfriend, now wife at the time, I said, I think there's a book here. And she said, oh, yeah, you should totally write it. And I don't think either of us knew exactly how much that entailed or how difficult that process is. But once I get a hold of something and start pulling on the thread, the more you discover, the more it becomes sort of an obsession.
You had already done military history before this, hadn't you? In terms of just studying it and being aware of it?
Well, I'm an intelligence officer by training, so the military history I do is sort of the current day. Most of my professional background is the war on terror, the Middle East. I've been in this business for 25 years, so 9/11 and onwards. I'd always been sort of a casual enjoyment reader of World War II history, but never a professional historian in sort of the sense that you're alluding to.
You have this curiosity. How do you go about digging out the information, tracking it down, etc.?
Well, the first place to stop is the National Archives, and now a lot of the records are being digitized. You can get them available online, which is great. And the Navy is a fantastic record keeper. And there was about, I'd say, between 3,000 and 5,000 pages of records in terms of what the ship did on a day-to-day basis. I also had the benefit of, there's a Cowpens Reunion Association that is active here in Cowpens, where I am today, that has been sort of collecting these materials and is a hub for the folks who served aboard the ship. And they have just been a huge help in not only helping me locate the few remaining veterans that are alive, but connecting me to some of the families that have materials left over, both diaries and journals and records. And it's some of those stories that really sort of gives the Cowpens tale its life. It's a biography of a ship told through the voices of the men who served aboard.
From that perspective, what did you find the most useful in understanding the story of the USS Cowpens?
There were a few particular individuals whose diaries and journals were critical in helping me understand, and I can talk about a couple of those. The first one was a guy by the name of Bob Price. And Bob was the commander of the ship's first fighter squadron, and then he moved up to be commander of its air group. A series of progressively, steadily more important jobs aboard ship. And sadly, he was lost in a typhoon in December of 44, but his family kept all his letters home and donated them all to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. When you put his story, because he couldn't be too detailed because there was a censor, but he would allude to things in his letters. And when you put that up against sort of the chronology of what came out of the official records, you could sort of see the things that he was alluding to. There was one letter. Their first combat mission did not go well at Wake. They lost 4 men shot down. 2 of them just disappeared. 2 others were shot down but recovered at sea. And he wrote to his wife, and he said something to the effect of, familiar faces fall by the wayside and it hurts, but over time we become accustomed and callous to it. And if you hadn't sort of put those sort of the timeline up against the letters, you wouldn't have known what he was referring to.
Is there an official U.S. Navy history of the ship?
Yes, and their daily reports. Yes, sir.
So the ship itself created an archival document just as part of its operating procedure.
Yes, and a lot of it. Every dogfight, every bombing mission, every day, very, very detailed.
It might help our listeners to understand the nature of these light carriers, which I think, are they the same as what we call Jeep carriers?
No, they're slightly different. So the Jeep carriers were built on the hulls of merchant ships, tankers or freighters, and they were slow. They couldn't keep up with the big fleet carriers. The light carriers were kind of in between. And essentially what they did is they took a light cruiser, which, they could go 30, 32 knots, and they put a flight deck on them. To be perfectly blunt, these were not great ships. And it was only because the U.S. Navy was so desperate at the time that it would ever build a ship like this. You have to remember that, in that first terrible year of the war, we started with 6 aircraft carriers, and by the end of 42, we were down to 2. And the situation was so desperate that we went to the British and said, hey, can you send one of your carriers out to the Pacific for 6 months, or actually 90 days, so we can send Enterprise into dry dock and get her battle wounds patched. So President Roosevelt, even before the war, he was worried that there just weren't enough flat tops to fight Japan. And he tried to convince the Navy to make these little light carriers. And the Navy gave them a real fight. They weren't interested. They had their construction program. They didn't appreciate their boss messing around in it. They didn't think such a small carrier would be valuable. And FDR gave him a fight, and finally he prevailed. And so they made one, and they were going to call it quits at that. But then they started losing the big carriers. And so every time you had a major loss at sea, Wasp, Hornet, Lexington, Yorktown, they'd queue up a batch of 2 or 3 of these light carriers. and send them out to the fleet as a backup, essentially. They were only there until the Essexes, the big ones, started becoming available in large numbers in the end of 44.
How many of the light carriers did they build?
They built 9. There's a lot of things that are notable about them, but one of the ones I find the neat is that 2 future presidents served aboard these light carriers. You had George H.W. Bush served aboard the San Jacinto, and Gerald Ford served aboard the Monterey.
These all took what had been laid down as a light cruiser hull and then just had a carrier put on top of it.
Just put a carrier on top of them. And they were tall. They had a very high center of gravity, which made them kind of tippy. They were very unstable in heavy seas. They had a 73-foot wide flight deck, which was the narrowest flight deck in the Navy. And that consequently gave them the highest accident rate in the Navy. These ships were very dangerous to fly from. And they were really crowded for their crew. I mean, they were built to hold 1,300 sailors aboard a light cruiser. The Navy packed 1,500 aboard as a carrier when you added the flight groups and things like that. So they left a lot to be desired as a ship.
This is not untypical that you have FDR, who was an extraordinarily powerful president, trying very hard to bully the Navy. And Roosevelt had been Undersecretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson and had a really deep interest in the Navy. And only when reality intervenes does the Navy agree finally to build these carriers.
Yeah, there was a great quote from FDR. He said, "Fighting with the admirals is like punching a feather bed. You punch and you punch and you punch and you punch, and then you stop punching and you see the feather bed is totally unchanged from when you started to begin with."
At one point, he said something to Admiral King, who was the chief of naval operations, like, "I know you think this is your Navy."
He knew the Navy. He knew a lot of the major commanders when he was Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I. He joked he was his own Secretary of the Navy.
How many aircraft could these light carriers carry?
Only 33. That's about a third of the big Essex class, depending on circumstance, but usually 24 fighters and 9 torpedo bombers.
Roosevelt is starting to build these things. It's a fascinating story about how it got to be named the Cowpens. This is such a classically American story.
It really is. So there's a Revolutionary War battle in upstate South Carolina. It was fought in a cow field, essentially, and they originally called it the Battle of the Cowpens, which over time just became Americanized to the Battle of Cowpens. And the little town that was nearby, probably 10, 15 miles down the road, in the late 19th century changed its name to Cowpens. And then in 1942, the local pharmacists sent a postcard to President Roosevelt. And at the time, the aircraft carriers were named for battles. And he wrote the president and said, "Hey, could we get an aircraft carrier named after our battle?" And FDR approved the suggestion, passed it on to the Navy, and the 4th of these Independence-class carriers became the Cowpens. And there is a currently serving USS Cowpens in the United States Navy. Sadly, she'll be decommissioned in August. The second ship was a guided missile cruiser and served with distinction since the late 1980s.
So Roosevelt basically names the ship at the suggestion of a drugstore owner.
Yes.
You make the point that the Cowpens got off as an aircraft carrier after it had been launched, that its initial experience is very tough.
She had a terrible streak of bad luck, and people began to think, sailors love their superstitions. Is this ship cursed? They started joking about the Cowpens jinx. The air group, when they flew aboard for the first time, that was a total mess. They had several crashes. One plane went overboard. On their shakedown cruise, they fouled their propeller on an anti-torpedo net in Norfolk, and they were hung there for 3 days. The Navy had to come down and cut them loose, and the captain got an official admonishment on his record. They went out to Pearl Harbor, and I mentioned their first combat mission was awful. And then afterwards, they were doing training exercises, and one of their escorting destroyers slammed into her, cut into her side. Thankfully, no one was hurt on the Moo, but 6 men were killed on board the destroyer. Sent her to the dry dock, and in the dry dock, they have a gasoline fire and an explosion. So her first few months in combat were just a real mess.
When all of that got done, apparently it's fate was turning, except that it encounters Typhoon Cobra. If I understand it correctly, Pacific typhoons are much bigger than Atlantic hurricanes.
They're some of the strongest storms on the planet, yes. They're really incredible. They're common at particular times of the year. The Philippines gets quite a few of them. My grandfather never talked about the combat, but boy, he was very forthright in how terrified he was during Typhoon Cobra. I mentioned the ship is kind of top-heavy and a little tippy. You know, you're going into a storm with 70 to 90-foot waves, winds of 100 to 120 knots. And on the bridge, they have a roll meter, and it goes 45 degrees to either side. And according to the captain at the time, a guy by the name of George DeBon, the needle would go all the way over to the 45 degrees and bounce on the peg at 45-degree roll, and then it would go back to the other side and bounce on that peg. So the ship was somewhere between 45 and 50-degree rolls for hours on end.
They're able to keep the aircraft tied down so they're not rolling with the ship?
Well, they had one break loose and it caught fire, and the men had to go out on the flight deck and put that out. But the bigger worry was the bombs in the magazine broke loose. So you've got 500 and 1,000 and 2,000-pound bombs bouncing around like tennis balls down there. The sailors had to go in and lasso them into place, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do, given that the ship is bucking like a wild horse.
That must have been terrifying. Imagine you were part of the bomb detail, and you're down there trying to tie down a bomb, and the ship is literally going back and forth under you in an uncontrollable way.
There was one guy, his name was Hartpence, I believe it was, and he went in and he refused to come out until the job was done. And they said that he would work for those brief seconds when the ship was kind of level, and then he would jump up and grab onto the overhead girders and pull himself up. They said it was shades of Tarzan, because otherwise this thing was going to roll over him and crush him. There were 3 destroyers that were lost in that storm. They capsized and sunk, killed almost 800 guys, and there was a board of inquiry for Admiral Halsey. He was nearly court-martialed for it.
For having allowed them to be out at risk or what?
The charge essentially was that he had had sufficient notice that there was a typhoon coming and that he had not acted with sufficient care to avoid it. Although, in his defense, meteorology in the 1940s was nowhere good as it is today. You know, there wasn't a satellite photo that you could say, this is the direction the storm is coming from. So there was a certain amount of guesswork and sort of speculation in terms of the weather. Where is the storm? Which direction is it coming from? And how close it is?
Why does the Cowpens become the first carrier to go into Tokyo Bay?
It's because Admiral Halsey didn't trust the Japanese. There was a lot of speculation at the time after sort of the betrayal and the double cross of Pearl Harbor that this whole, announcement that Tokyo will surrender was a trap. That what they were going to do is they were going to invite the Americans into Pearl Harbor, and then they were going to swarm them with kamikazes, and it was going to be a terrible slaughter. So Admiral Halsey has all his big, irreplaceable Essex-class carriers, and he wants them safely out at sea where they can't be hurt. It's kind of this irony that the little carrier that nobody expected so much from, is given the biggest honor in her wartime career because she was expendable. Admiral Halsey didn't need her.
In your book, you note that in the course of the war, this Jinx Ship, if you will, steamed over 200,000 miles, launched 11,275 sorties, dropped 620 tons of bombs, sank 16 ships, damaged many others, destroyed 93 planes in the air, and another 512 on the ground, and without ever being hit by the enemy. And she earned 12 battle stars, the most of any light carrier. That's a pretty remarkable record.
She had quite a good run. Even from sort of a clinical, historical perspective, if you had no connection to the ship, I think that's still very impressive. And for me, my grandfather was there, and I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of men and their families who were there, and they're still intensely proud of what this ship did for our country during the Second World War.
When you had a chance to interview veterans, were they willing to talk about their experiences on the ship?
Perhaps the way to say it is sometimes they were selective in the things that they were going to talk about. They would be happy to talk about the good times they had, the friends they made, what it was like aboard. Getting them to talk about combat was harder. perhaps that's common of so many veterans, even today. You don't want to relive the trauma. You want to relive the good times, the brotherhood, the comradeship. I could sort of, as a historian, put the pieces together between what they told me, the letters, the documents, and then the official records, which were unsparing in describing the fighting, at times how close it was.
As you researched this book, did it change your understanding of World War II?
It did. I was listening to your podcast just this morning about General Eisenhower. That's a great case of sort of the great man history, theory of history. And I think, oftentimes we focus on the generals and admirals, and, there's absolutely a great reason for that. This was sort of, for me, a grassroots story of the war. What was it like for the everyday Americans who did their bit and came home? Everything from what was the food like? What was the ship like to live on? What was it like for my grandfather, who was 22 years old and never been away from upstate New York? What was it like to be on a carrier in the middle of the Pacific when you'd never done anything like that before? So I don't think it changed my grand narrative of the war. I think it helped me understand perhaps what it was like.
As a historian, I really appreciate the ability to take a thread like this and follow it all the way through and figure out what it means and how it happened. Now that you've done that with the Cowpens, are you considering writing more about either World War II or about military history in general?
Submarine warfare kind of piqued my interest. There was a quote by Admiral Halsey. He's a carrier commander. He loves his carriers. And someone asked him, what are the top 5 things that led to victory in the Pacific? And he rated the carriers third and submarines first. So the fact that this guy he loves his carriers, that he says, well, really, it was kind of the submarines that was the biggest factor to victory, has got me pulling on that thread now.
Well, and of course, World War II submarines were totally different from modern nuclear submarines. You go visit one of these museums and get into a World War II sub, you realize how small they were. And again, the huge difference between, for example, the British subs that served mostly in the North Atlantic and American submarines, which have to be capable of operating across the entire Pacific, which is just a huge, huge problem. That is one of the great epics. So are you going to write about one or more submarines, or how are you going to approach it?
I'm looking at 1944, which is when, if you take a look at the monthly sinkings, total tonnage, essentially the submarine force did not resolve its problems until late 43 in terms of its broken torpedoes and some of its leadership and tactics problems. But by early 44, they'd pretty much gotten it all together. It honestly just took them till November of that year, and then the daily tonnage totals started plummeting and never recovered. So 44 was the decisive year for submarine warfare.
In an ironic way, our merchant marine submarine campaign was dramatically more effective in isolating Japan than the much more famous German campaign against North Atlantic merchants. I mean, the Japanese never had the resources to actually wage an effective anti-submarine war.
And they didn't want to. Culturally, they viewed the war entirely through an offensive lens, and so they came to convoy tactics and destroyer escorts very late in the game.
There's a funny scene in the beginning of the Caine Mutiny where this young ensign who was graduated from college joined the Navy, and the chief petty officer who's teaching a course on submarines says that the submarine is a fleet offensive weapon and is not a merchant raider. And the young guy goes, "Sir, here's the front page of the New York Times this morning telling us how the Germans are using it against merchant marine." And the chief petty officer says, "Son, in this Navy, the submarine is a fleet offensive weapon and not to be used against merchant ships. Do you understand me?" Herman Wouk, who wrote the book, told me one day that he was the guy he's writing about. He was in the room. He was the young student. He did raise the issue. And of course, as long as it was the Germans sinking Allied merchant ships, we were really against it. The minute we did an analysis in the Pacific, we decided, okay, we can really learn how to do this. It's an amazing story. I look forward to your next book. It's a great topic.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Nathan, I want to thank you for joining me. This has been a great venture into an area I didn't know all that well. Your new book, The Mighty Moo, the USS Cowpens and her epic World War II journey from Jinx Ship to the Navy's first carrier into Tokyo Bay, is available on Amazon and bookstores everywhere. It's well-researched, It's just a fascinating story, and I look forward very much to a chance in the future to have you come back into a future podcast on your book on submarines.
It's a date. Thank you, sir. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you to my guest, Nathan Canestaro. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Mighty Moo, the USS Cowpens and her epic World War II journey from Jinx Ship to the Navy's first carrier into Tokyo Bay, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.